For decades, the mysterious archives of Ed and Lorraine Warren remained locked away from the public eye. Files so terrifying, so deeply controversial, that even fellow demonologists hesitated to acknowledge their existence. But now, for the first time, these hidden exorcism records are finally being revealed. What secrets were too dangerous to share? Why were these cases buried in silence? And what do they expose about the true nature of the battles the Warrens fought in the name of the divine? The house on Knollwood Street was quiet now. Decades had passed since Ed and Lorraine Warren last conducted a formal investigation from within those walls, but the air still held a thick, strange stillness, like it remembered. Beneath the modest, suburban home in Monroe, Connecticut, there was a basement, and inside that basement, a sealed room. Few were allowed inside. Fewer still knew it existed. Tony Spira, the Warrens' son-in-law and current caretaker of their legacy, had always respected that door. Only if absolutely necessary. Ed had once warned him, his voice hard but protective. For years, Tony never questioned it. But one late October evening in 2021, after an unexplained power surge disabled the entire security system of the Warren Occult Museum, he found himself compelled to investigate. That night, he opened the sealed room. Dust danced in the beam of his flashlight. Shelves lined with rusting lockboxes and worn folders covered in cryptic symbols surrounded him. On the back wall, a steel cabinet, twice locked, bore only a single word carved by hand: Damnatus. Condemned. Inside were tapes, photographs, field notes, and relics. But these weren't like the other cases displayed for curious visitors. These were different. These files, handwritten by Ed, transcribed in haste by Lorraine, contained accounts never spoken of publicly. Exorcisms so extreme, their documentation had been hidden away to protect the people involved, and possibly the rest of us. One file was marked with a red wax seal. It read, Case 277, The Splintered Soul. Attached to it was a photo of a nun in full habit, her face obscured not by shadow, but by what appeared to be an unnatural blur. Lorraine's note beside it read, She looked at me and spoke in two voices. One begged for mercy, the other mocked the rosary. Tony froze. That was not the only entry. Another was titled The Mirror That Reversed the Cross. One more. The voice from behind the child's eyes. And the thickest folder of all, marked only with the phrase, Do Not Reopen. The Warrens had kept these hidden for a reason. But the deeper Tony read, the more he understood. These were not ordinary hauntings. These were events that tested the very nature of spiritual boundaries, conflicts between belief and malevolence that could fracture even the strongest soul. He began digitizing the documents, hoping to preserve the material without releasing it too widely. But once the files existed in digital form, someone found them, and now we are left to unravel what was meant to remain buried. It began with whispers behind the altar. In the winter of 1965, the Carmelite convent in Springfield, Massachusetts, reached out through quiet channels to the Warrens, not through official clergy, but through a desperate janitor named Elias, who had seen Lorraine speak during a small lecture at Holy Cross. His note, handwritten in shaky ink, read only, Something terrible is happening to Sister Mary Augustine. She weeps when there is no sorrow. She bleeds when there is no wound. The convent had reported increasingly erratic behavior from the young nun. Mary Augustine was once known for her serenity, her clear singing voice during Mass, and her devotion to silence. But now she spoke incessantly in the chapel, always in tongues, always with eyes closed. At night, other sisters claimed to hear her pacing the hallways, repeating psalms backwards. When Ed and Lorraine arrived, they were greeted not by the Mother Superior, but by silence. No formal welcome, no prepared room. They were escorted to the lower floor of the convent, where Mary had been isolated. What they saw disturbed them both. She was seated on the floor, legs crossed in perfect stillness. Her habit was stained with earth, as if she had been buried and exhumed. Her eyes, closed, moved rapidly beneath the lids. And then, as Lorraine stepped closer, they opened, but not both. Only one eye looked at Lorraine. The other remained closed and twitching. And then came the voices. "Please," whispered one from the left side of her mouth. "Do not let him back inside." From the right, a deep, snarling voice growled, "She's mine. You have no authority here." Lorraine collapsed, not from fear, but from the overwhelming rush of grief, pain, and nausea that surged through her body. Ed caught her, lifting her away from the nun. "We're not alone," he said. "There's something layered inside her, two entities sharing the same vessel, but one is not human." The local priest refused to sanction an exorcism. He feared repercussions from the diocese. So the Warrens proceeded on their own, invoking the authority of a higher power in secret. Over 3 nights, they conducted a private rite, assisted by 2 retired nuns and a Protestant pastor who had faced similar phenomena in Africa. Lorraine remained in trance nearly the entire time. She would later recall visions of Sister Mary as a child, surrounded by fields of white lilies, then abruptly consumed by fire that spoke in Latin. On the 3rd night, during the final prayers of deliverance, Sister Mary began to shake violently. A stench of sulfur filled the room, the windows fogged from inside. Ed, holding the crucifix, shouted the final invocation as Lorraine wept, bleeding from her ears, and then silence. Sister Mary collapsed. Her pulse was steady, her breathing normal. She woke, confused, with no memory of the past month, but the aftermath was not simple. 2 of the assisting nuns would later leave the convent, claiming to be haunted by a voice at night. The pastor vanished 6 weeks later during a mission trip to Haiti. And the church? The church never acknowledged what occurred within its walls. Only the Warren file remained, hidden beneath the basement, until now. It was supposed to be a consultation, the fall of 1973. The Warrens received a cryptic letter from a state trooper stationed near the Adirondack Mountains in upstate New York. He didn't sign his name, and the letter bore no return address. All it said was, "There is a group in the pines. They don't worship what they think they do. One of them disappeared. They found the body, but the soul was missing. You need to see it." Ed was intrigued, though skeptical. Cult activity had surged in the late 60s and early 70s, and many cases turned out to be criminal, not supernatural. But this had markings of something deeper. Lorraine, ever sensitive to the spiritual resonance of a place, agreed the letter had weight. They packed for a 3-day trip and drove north, arriving at a modest ranger's cabin on the outskirts of a dense forest near Ticonderoga. The trooper, who finally introduced himself only as Reed, met them at dusk. "I'm not bringing you to their circle," he said, "just to what's left of the man they lost." The remains of the missing cult member were stored in a local mortuary. His name was Glenn Hurst, 27, reported missing for 6 days and found in a ravine with no visible trauma, yet an expression of extreme agony frozen on his face. But it wasn't the condition of the body that troubled Ed. It was the reaction of the coroner. "I've done this 18 years, the man said, "and I've never seen a corpse with eyes that look afraid of you." Lorraine stood over the body, in silence. Then she touched Glenn's hand. Her body went rigid. She turned to Ed and whispered. He saw something in the fire, and it knew his name. That night, against Reed's warning, the Warrens followed an energy trail Lorraine described as pulling like gravity. It led them into the forest to a clearing littered with charred stones and inverted crosses carved into tree trunks. There were ashes, recent. Lorraine fell to her knees. "This was a summoning," she said, "but not of a demon. Something older, something hungry." Suddenly, the forest fell unnaturally silent. Then came the low chant, distant, male and female, voices together, moving in a circle. The Warrens didn't wait. They fled back to the cabin, but the next morning, 2 men in plain black suits arrived, showing federal identification and asking pointed questions. What had they seen? Had they spoken to anyone? Were they planning to publish findings? The men left no card, no names. Only a final warning. "This is bigger than your expertise, Mr. Warren. Let it go." Ed never filed the case with any SPR, but he recorded one thing in a personal notebook found years later in the hidden room. This wasn't a cult worshipping a demon. It was a demon recruiting a cult. Lorraine always said the worst hauntings were not loud, but quiet. In the spring of 1978, a reclusive couple in rural Connecticut contacted the Warrens. They owned a colonial-era farmhouse that had been in the wife's family for 6 generations. Recently, however, the land felt wrong. Crops died prematurely. Neighbors' pets refused to cross the fence. And most disturbingly, the couple heard voices beneath the floorboards at night. Soft, rhythmic, like someone praying in a language they didn't know. Ed and Lorraine arrived during a heavy storm. The house was isolated, surrounded by wet woods that bent inward, almost shielding the structure like a living prison. Lorraine immediately sensed the distortion in energy. Something old had taken root, hidden but growing. They were led to the basement, stone-walled, damp, and coated in mildew. In one corner, a loose panel revealed a hidden crawl space. That's where Lorraine insisted the energy was centered. Ed lowered himself in with a flashlight and found a circle of wax melted around symbols scorched into the dirt. And at the center, buried beneath a child's blanket, was a crucifix, inverted and split in half. They began recording immediately. Lorraine, in her medium trance state, sat at the circle's edge and began to speak, not in her voice, but in Latin. Words neither she nor Ed fully understood. On playback later, it translated to, "The door was opened by blood. The silence is not safety. The child is marked." Suddenly, Lorraine began to convulse. Her breath caught in her throat. Her eyes fluttered. Then she screamed, not in fear, but in agony. Ed pulled her from the crawl space, but she remained unconscious for nearly 10 minutes. When she awoke, she was crying. They offered a child once, and it didn't end. It never ended. The ritual beneath the house had been part of a generational curse. An ancestor of the current owners had engaged in a rite to barter prosperity in exchange for obedience to a dark force. Each generation was to make a small offering, a goat, a bird, a silence kept. But the last offering had been interrupted. When a child ran into the circle and touched the sigil, Lorraine insisted the circle be purified. They brought in a Dominican priest under the guise of a blessing. But as the rite began, the temperature dropped below freezing. The candle flames bent inward toward the center of the circle. A voice hissed from beneath the floorboards, mimicking the priest's own Latin prayers, backwards. And then came the laughter. High, thin, and filled with joyless cruelty. The blessing was completed, but the priest later described a presence that left the house, but not the land. The Warrens advised the couple to move, but they refused. Within a year, their young nephew vanished while playing near the cellar. His shoes were found beside the circle. Ed Warren was not easily shaken. He had faced growling voices in the dark, chairs that levitated, mirrors that reflected the dead. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared him for the entity known only as the Shadow Prince. The case began with a call from a Catholic seminarian in Baltimore who claimed to have seen a living silhouette during nightly prayers. At first, Ed believed it was a case of sleep paralysis, a condition commonly confused with spiritual attack. But then the young man mailed the Warrens a cassette recording he'd made during one of the incidents. On it, faint but audible, was the Lord's Prayer, distorted. Words reversed and echoed, as if spoken from beneath the floor of reality. Ed and Lorraine traveled to the seminary, housed in a 19th century building with deep Gothic architecture, sharp arches, and candlelit corridors that seemed to bend sound. The air inside was heavy. Lorraine immediately refused to go near the old chapel. "I can't breathe in there," she said. "Something's watching through time itself." They met with the seminarian, who was pale and trembling. He had stopped sleeping, claiming the entity would visit each night at 3:03 a.m., not just appearing, but speaking to him in his own voice. "It tells me what I will become. It shows me the future." Burning. That night, Ed set up observation equipment, cameras, audio, holy water, a crucifix blessed by Father Gallo, a trusted exorcist. At exactly 3:03 a.m., the temperature dropped. The window glass frosted over from the inside. The candles they'd left unlit ignited themselves, and then came the shadow. It stepped through the doorway without touching the door, a figure darker than the dark. No eyes, no face, but the suggestion of a crown-like distortion above its head, like thorns bending light. Ed stood firm, invoking the right of St. Michael. The shadow didn't retreat. It laughed, a deep, resonating vibration that shook the camera off its tripod. Then it spoke, not in a guttural growl, but in Ed's voice. "You believe in your books, but I wrote them." Ed lunged forward, holding the crucifix. The shadow dissipated like smoke in wind, but the seminarian was left changed. Within weeks, he left the seminary, abandoning faith altogether. He claimed the entity still visited him, but only in reflections. Ed never classified the case as an exorcism. In his private notes, he wrote, "We did not face a demon. We faced something worse, a being that knows Scripture but owns none of it, a creature of mockery, born of silence between prayers." The tape was unmarked. Ed found it in a brown envelope outside the museum in 1984. No return address, no note, just a cassette and a photograph of a boy, no older than 10, with empty eyes. The Warrens listened to the tape that night. It began with static, then a woman's voice, cracking with fear. "He's still here. It didn't work. We tried. Oh God, we tried." What followed was the sound of an exorcism. Latin phrases, gasps, a child's scream so raw it stopped Lorraine, mid-breath. Then silence. Then a man's voice whispering. He opened the wrong door. The Warrens traced the voice to a small town in rural Pennsylvania. The boy's name was Matthew. His mother had contacted a fringe priest who promised a quick ritual, one that didn't require church authorization. The ritual went wrong. Horribly wrong. When Ed and Lorraine arrived, they found Matthew in his room, unmoving, eyes wide open. Alive, but completely unresponsive. No diagnosis, no trauma, just stillness. The mother sobbed as Lorraine entered the room. "He's in there, but he's stuck." Lorraine touched Matthew's hand. Her vision blurred. She saw not darkness, but a hallway, endless, flickering. At the end, Matthew stood before a door. Behind him, shadows moved like tendrils. Lorraine whispered to him, even as he didn't blink, "Come back. You are not alone." Ed attempted a minor rite of purification, but the candles wouldn't light. The walls pulsed, literally expanded and contracted, like the house itself was breathing. And then, from the hallway upstairs, they heard a voice that didn't belong to anyone present. "Stop. He belongs to me." The voice wasn't loud. It was spoken clearly, softly, and it came from behind the closed closet door in Matthew's room. Ed opened it. There was nothing there, but a scratch appeared across his forearm. 3 thin lines. They brought in a sanctioned exorcist, but he never made it to the house. His car veered off a bridge en route. No one else would come. The Warrens stayed 3 more days. They prayed. They sang hymns. Lorraine sat beside Matthew each hour, holding his hand, but the boy never moved. Eventually, they left. There was nothing more they could do. Matthew lived for 12 more years. He never spoke again. Lorraine would later write, "Some doors once opened do not close. And sometimes the person doesn't leave. They just forget how to return." Thank you so much for staying with us this far. If you've made it to this point in the story, you are among the most engaged and curious souls who seek understanding. Beyond the veil, we appreciate your presence deeply. And trust me, the best and darkest revelations are still to come. Lorraine had visions all her life. Some came softly, shimmers of the past or echoes of grief. Others struck her like lightning, but none ever frightened her like the one she encountered in the case they called the False Heaven. It began in Vermont, where a grieving family contacted the Warrens after a series of dreams turned into shared hallucinations. The father, mother, and their 2 teenage daughters claimed to have visited a beautiful place during sleep, always the eye. Same, a lush, endless meadow filled with golden light. There they heard voices of their dead relatives beckoning them forward. It felt peaceful, but it wasn't. One night, the younger daughter, Melissa, did not wake up. Her eyes were open, her body frozen in bed. Doctors found no medical cause. Her vitals were fine, but her mind was unreachable. That's when Lorraine insisted they visit. She knew immediately. The energy in the home was not warm. It was sweet. Too sweet. Like overripe fruit masking rot. Lorraine entered a deep trance, hoping to connect with Melissa. Instead, she was pulled somewhere else. In her vision, Lorraine found herself in the meadow. It was beautiful. Flowers shimmered with impossible colors, and every sound echoed like music. But as she walked, she noticed the sun never moved. Shadows never changed. The air never cooled. That's when she saw them. People, smiling, motionless. Each wore white. Each stood perfectly still, hands by their sides, staring forward. Lorraine walked past hundreds before realizing their eyes didn't blink. They weren't alive. They weren't even dreaming. They were trapped. Suddenly, the ground beneath her turned black. The sky split, and from behind her, a voice that was not a voice said, "We made it beautiful so you'd never want to leave." Lorraine woke up screaming, with blood dripping from her nose. She was unconscious for 6 hours. Ed later found a diary entry from Melissa, written days before her trance. It read, "I think I found heaven in my sleep. I don't want to wake up anymore." The Warrens initiated a cleansing ritual, but Lorraine hesitated. She feared that breaking the connection might kill Melissa, but doing nothing would doom her soul to that place forever. With the family gathered in prayer, Lorraine tried one last time to reach the girl. She spoke into her ear, reminding her of a childhood memory, her first dog, Pepper, the cold winter mornings, hot chocolate. Melissa blinked. One tear rolled down her cheek. She awoke, gasping, and for months afterward, she would wake screaming, every night at 3 a.m., whispering, "They're still smiling, they want me back." Some objects reflect more than appearances. In 1987, the Warrens acquired a large mirror from a castle estate auction in Bavaria, Germany. The item had belonged to the von Stein family, a lineage marked by whispers of madness, suicide, and occultism. The mirror, nearly 7 feet tall, had not been touched in years. It was found in a sealed chamber, wrapped in thick linen, and stored with instructions never to expose it to candlelight. Ed knew immediately, this was no ordinary item. He had it transported under strict conditions and placed it in the basement. Vault, never displayed. Lorraine refused to enter the room while it was stored there. It wasn't until 1991 that they decided to document its true nature. The moment the cloth was removed, the mirror fogged from the inside. It was cold, unnaturally cold, even in summer. Lorraine stared into it and recoiled. "It doesn't reflect," she said. "It responds." They performed a controlled observation. The first anomaly was simple. The mirror reversed all text, not just horizontally, but vertically and phonetically. The Lord's Prayer, when recited before it, echoed back, distorted, garbled, as if mocked by something trying to speak human. The second anomaly was more disturbing. When a volunteer stood in front of the mirror for 5 minutes, his reflection smiled independently after he had stopped. They tried again. This time, the reflection blinked out of sync, then tilted its head, while the man remained still. Ed ended the test immediately, but Lorraine insisted on one final session. She entered a trance and stood before the mirror alone, recording everything. Her eyes turned glassy. She whispered what she saw. A man in chains. A woman with no mouth. A hallway made of eyes. They are inside the mirror, or the mirror is inside them. Then she collapsed. The mirror was rewrapped and sealed in a specially blessed container. It remains locked in the vault to this day. Eddie left only one note attached. Do not show your reflection to something that remembers when mirrors were portals, not glass. Some truths should never be written. In early 1994, a box arrived anonymously at the Warren residence. It was old, handmade from wood, tied with decaying leather straps. Inside were dozens of pages, no letter, no explanation, just transcripts, detailed. Exorcism accounts written in a blend of Latin, Greek, and an unknown script that appeared only under candlelight. The Warrens attempted translation using old ecclesiastical dictionaries and occult references. What they discovered disturbed them. These weren't just reports of demonic presence. They were dialogues, conversations between the afflicted and something else, recorded by unknown hands. One transcript detailed a man possessed by an entity that called itself No One. It spoke with perfect knowledge of the man's sins, some even he had forgotten. Another recorded a rite in which a young girl screamed the name of a priest who would not be ordained for another 30 years. Most chilling was a final document labeled Testimony of the Fallen. It contained 66 names, some biblical, some ancient, and described their roles not in hell, but in misguiding faith on earth. Lorraine grew increasingly uneasy. She began hearing whispers during sleep, all in languages she had never studied but now suddenly understood. Ed, too, became affected. He developed migraines. His hands trembled. The house grew colder, without cause. Tony Spera, concerned for their health, urged them to destroy the pages, but the Warrens refused. Instead, they stored them in lead-lined cases, sealed with prayer and iron nails, but the damage was already done. Within weeks, one of Ed's longtime research assistants was found dead in his apartment, surrounded by open pages from the box. No signs of struggle. The cause of death: cardiac arrest at 29 years old. On his desk was a note scribbled repeatedly. They read me back. A journalist who requested access to the documents for a planned book suffered a breakdown before even seeing them, simply after Lorraine warned him what they contained. He later confessed to hearing voices calling him by name during sleep. Voices that knew things no one should. After this, the Warrens instituted what Ed called the Silence Doctrine. No one was to access the box again. It was buried beneath the museum's floor under consecrated ground, because, as Lorraine wrote in her final log on the case, these are not testimonies. They are traps. Words can be doors, and doors can open from either side. There comes a point in every spiritual warrior's life when knowledge ceases to be a weapon and becomes a wound. For the Warrens, that moment came in late 1995. The toll of what they had uncovered, preserved, and protected had grown heavier with each passing year. The files, the cursed, the unspeakable, the unfiled, had begun to change the energy not just of the museum, but of their lives. Lorraine, once vibrant and intuitive, began suffering from waking visions. She would stare at guests and speak names they hadn't told her. She no longer touched certain relics. "They're waiting," she once said, "but I won't say for what." Ed was aging faster than his years. He had trouble remembering what was real and what had been recorded. Sometimes he mistook a visitor's voice for one he had heard in the crawl space beneath the Connecticut farmhouse. It was time. One stormy night, under strict ritual and with the help of 2 trusted clergy, the Warrens descended into the basement. For the last time as investigators, they carried with them holy water from Lourdes, a key blessed in Rome, a silver ring containing relics of 3 saints. They opened the sealed room. All files deemed too dangerous were placed in iron boxes. Each was wrapped in linen, sprayed with exorcised oil, and marked with Ed's initials and Lorraine's final blessing. As the final box was sealed, Lorraine placed her hand upon it and whispered, "You will not be unmade by light, but you will never again see it." The vault was locked. The key was buried in a consecrated cemetery near their church, in a grave that bore no name. These cases, the splintered soul, the mirror, the false heaven, the shadow prince, would remain hidden, spoken of only in hushed tones by those who truly understood what the Warrens had faced. They did not act out of fear, they acted out of mercy, because some knowledge once seen infects not the mind, but the soul. The question remains, now that you've glimpsed it, do you feel it watching you too? And now, we turn to you. What do you believe? Should these files have remained buried, Or are we meant to confront the darkness to better understand the light? Leave your thoughts in the comments. And if this story moved you, if it rattled your perception of the world, subscribe to the channel and prepare yourself, because our next video reveals something even more forbidden and far closer than you might expect.